I recently spoke with a researcher who spent years digging through the shipping manifests of the 1840s. He described a scene that has stayed with me ever since. A bustling Irish port, thick with the smell of salt and tension. While the surrounding countryside was collapsing into a nightmare of blight and hollowed-out villages, the docks were a hive of industrial efficiency. He pointed out that on the very same days history books tell us people were starving, the ledgers show ship after ship being loaded to the brim with high-quality butter, crates of eggs, and prime beef, all destined for the dinner tables of London. It's a jarring image that completely upends the way we're taught to think about tragedy. Usually when we hear the word famine, we picture cracked earth, empty fields, and a cruel act of nature. We think of it as a geographical misfortune, an accident of the climate. But as he walked me through those records, it felt less like a natural disaster and more like a cold, calculated logistics problem. What was most unsettling was the tone of the officials from that era. They weren't twirling their mustaches like villains. They were talking about market stability and the sanctity of contracts. They were quite literally watching food leave a starving country because the paperwork said it belonged somewhere else. It's the paradox of the locked warehouse. The food exists, the shelves are full, but the person with the key has decided that certain people simply don't qualify to eat. This realization that starvation is rarely about a lack of calories and almost always about the weaponization of a spreadsheet changes everything. It suggests that the most devastating famines in history weren't caused by a failure of the soil, but by a deliberate choice in a distant office. It forces us to look past the weather reports and start looking at the maps of power, leading to a much darker question. If there was always enough food, why were some people chosen to starve?
That is a deeply unsettling insight. And it really hits on the core idea that frames this entire deep dive we're about to have. Food security is fundamentally a matter of access and entitlement. It's not just about availability or how much we can produce.
Right.
The Irish Famine taught us a brutal lesson. It shows that a systemic failure, one that's underpinned by a political and economic ideology that prioritizes contracts over people, well, that can be just as devastating as a catastrophic crop failure.
So if that historical tragedy was really a result of a cold, calculated logistics problem, then our mission today is to figure out how our modern, vastly more complex global food system performs under pressure.
Exactly.
Are we just repeating the same mistakes, but on a global, hyper-digital scale?
That's the question. Yeah. We really need to examine how these current systems, which are, let's be honest, they're optimized for pure efficiency, how they generate these catastrophic fragilities.
Okay.
And we'll look at how states are now finally actively trying to build resilience against the strategic use of food as a political or even an economic weapon.
And this brings us to what you call the central conflict that runs through all the research.
Precisely. It's this tension between two completely opposing systems of distribution.
Okay, so what are they?
On one side, you have the highly efficient, yet inherently fragile global corporate value chains.
The big guys. The just-in-time systems built for speed and profit.
The very same. And then on the other side, you have something very different, the more diverse, locally rooted, and it turns out much more resilient territorial markets.
Right.
And the thing is, all these recent cascading crises, I mean, from the pandemic to the Ukraine conflict to these intensifying climate shocks, they have absolutely shattered that old illusion of, frictionless global supply chains.
It's all broken down.
It has. It's forcing governments all over the world to completely reevaluate their entire national food strategy. The system that was built for maximizing efficiency is proving to be disastrously bad at managing resilience.
So let's unpack that core principle again. You said the world produces more than enough calories to feed every person alive. That's a fact we should start with.
It's the baseline. We are not talking about a supply issue at a global level. Hunger, therefore, is almost never about a sheer lack of caloric capacity.
It's a systemic failure. It's where the entitlement to that food is stripped away.
Exactly.
Oh.
And that stripping away is a function of power, not botany.
The function of power.
Yeah. When you look at the economics of famine, the late economist Amartya Sen, he famously laid this out. He argued that famines do not typically happen in functioning democracies.
Why not?
Because leaders are held accountable. I mean, it's pretty simple. If mass starvation occurs, the leadership loses office, or they face a revolt.
So it's a political calculation.
It is. Famines happen where a regime can basically afford to allow a specific, politically marginalized group of people to just disappear without threatening the stability of the central government. It's a failure of governance, not just a failure of the harvest.
So the common thread here between what happened in Ireland in the 1840s and what we see today is this distance, the distance between the consequences and the insulated decision makers.
That's a great way to put it. The leaders, or in our modern context, you could say the corporate executives, they view the consequences not as human suffering, but as
necessary market corrections.
Or numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And that systemic failure, the one optimized for efficiency and profit over human need, it goes far beyond just direct acute starvation today.
How so?
Our current global food system. It drives systemic failures that hurt the entire global economy and threaten ecological stability, even when there's plenty of food around.
Okay, so we're talking about massive, measurable economic costs that are directly tied to how we produce and distribute food. What are some of those specific costs?
They are, frankly, staggering. Let's start with the health crisis. We have what's called the triple burden of malnutrition.
The triple burden.
Yes. It's undernutrition, so not enough calories, micronutrient deficiencies, which is hidden hunger, and crucially, overnutrition, or obesity. These are leading global health risks.
And the costs.
The World Health Organization estimates that diet-related diseases now cost global economies an estimated $3.5 trillion annually.
3.5 trillion. That's an almost incomprehensible figure. How is that even broken down?
Well, it's highly distributed. A huge portion of that 3.5 trillion comes from, the direct medical costs, treating things like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular issues, hypertension.
All the things often linked to diets high in processed foods.
The very products the global system is optimized to produce cheaply and in mass quantities. But, beyond the direct medical bills, you have these staggering indirect costs.
Like what?
Lost labor productivity due to illness, increased disability, premature mortality. This system generates food that is incredibly calorie-dense and resource-intensive, but it's often nutritionally just inadequate. It's essentially making us sick at scale.
So if the health costs are that high, the environmental footprint must be equally shocking.
It is. Agriculture, at least as it's currently practiced, is pushing us toward critical planetary boundary crossings. It's responsible for a staggering 80% of global deforestation.
80%?
Yeah, and that's primarily driven by the expansion of large-scale commodity crops. We're talking about soy, palm oil, and beef production.
And water.
It accounts for 70% of global freshwater withdrawals. This often leads to rapid aquifer depletion and serious water stress, especially in arid regions.
What about its contribution to climate change? I hear that's a huge piece of the puzzle.
It is. Agriculture and related land use changes contribute nearly 1/3 of all global greenhouse gas emissions.
A third? Wow.
A significant portion of that comes from methane released by livestock and nitrous oxide from the synthetic fertilizers that are necessary for the kind of monocultures that sustain these global corporate chains.
So the system that's optimized for cheap, high-volume output is simultaneously destroying the very natural resource base it needs to survive.
It's completely self-defeating.
Which brings us to resource depletion. We're basically consuming the Earth's capital faster than it can regenerate.
Exactly. I mean, look at the data. Over 50% of the world's population already faces seasonal or chronic water shortages. And that number is projected to grow significantly.
And what about land? You can't just make more of it.
No, you can't. And arable land has shrunk by nearly 30% over the last 60 years. That's due to soil degradation, erosion, and urbanization.
So let me get this straight. By 2050, we'll need to feed close to 10 billion people.
Correct.
From a dwindling and increasingly fragile land envelope. And at the same time, we have competing demands from cities and even renewable energy like solar farms, putting more pressure on that same finite resource.
That is the challenge in a nutshell.
So when we look at the total picture, the global food system, which was built for profit maximization and this relentless short-term efficiency, it's become a massive generator of systemic failure.
It's a catalyst for economic, environmental, and social breakdown. And that's even before a major weather shock or a conflict hits.
It is a system that is, as you said, fundamentally brittle.
And its structural flaws are precisely what allow for its fragility to be exploited and weaponized, which is the next critical step in our analysis.
Okay, let's look at that brittleness. This optimization of corporate value chains for speed and cost. It's created these profound vulnerabilities. The reliance on just-in-time systems, where inventory is kept lean and centralized, means any disruption causes an immediate shockwave.
It does.
So what are the hard numbers that illustrate this hyper-concentration?
The concentration is startling. And it exists at every single level of the supply chain.
Every level.
Every level. Start with the trade itself. Just 7 major grain traders, you might hear them called the ABCDs, they control at least 50% of the global grain trade.
Just 7 companies.
7 massive, often privately held companies that dictate the flow of essential commodities around the entire world. When only a handful of actors control that much leverage, any decision they make or any failure they experience is immediately globalized.
And that control, it must extend all the way back to the farm gate, right? To the very beginning of the process.
It does. On the supply side, we see these oligopolies dominating the inputs. 6 major corporations now control 78% of the agrochemical market.
So herbicides, pesticides.
Everything you need for industrial farming. And those same companies also control 58% of the commercial seed market.
Which means that if something happens to just one of those firms, a climate shock, a geopolitical event, farmers all over the world might be left scrambling for the seeds or chemicals they need to even start planting.
It completely removes diversity and local control at the most foundational level.
And you mentioned this concentration isn't just corporate, it's also physical. It's in the real world, which makes the whole system physically vulnerable.
Absolutely. The logistics network is physically centralized through a series of global choke points.
Choke points.
Yeah. The majority of the world's staple crops, the wheat, maize, rice, and soy that feed billions, they all pass through only 14 critical choke points.
And we're not just talking about canals like the Suez or Panama.
No, not just those. There are also specialized logistics hubs, like the major ports in the Black Sea or on the U.S. Gulf Coast. If one of those choke points is closed by a natural disaster, a conflict, an infrastructure failure, the entire global price structure convulses instantly.
And we got a very painful demonstration of this rigidity with the just-in-time model during the initial shock of the COVID pandemic, didn't we?
We did. That rigidity was a direct consequence of the optimization. The system was engineered with incredible precision to move food from large industrial producers directly to specific institutional buyers.
Schools, cruise lines, big restaurants.
Corporate canteens, exactly. When global lockdowns instantly shifted all that demand to household grocery stores, the processing and packaging infrastructure, it just couldn't pivot fast enough.
So what were the actual physical consequences of that infrastructure failure? What happened on the ground?
The waste was immense. It was heartbreaking. In the U.S. alone, the processing bottlenecks forced dairy farmers to dump up to 3.7 million gallons of milk.
Per day? Oh.
Because the specialized packaging plants that are required for retail cartons couldn't handle the sudden volume, and all their bulk buyers had just vanished overnight.
And it was the same in the meat industry.
It was. Processing plant shutdowns due to COVID outbreaks meant an estimated 10 million pigs had to be culled.
Not because people stopped eating pork,
but because there was literally nowhere for them to be processed, packaged, and distributed under the new paradigm. The food was physically there, but the logistics chain, that inflexible chain, failed. It created scarcity and massive waste at the exact same time.
So that describes the system failing on its own, but now we have to shift to a much more dangerous idea. The transition from that kind of fragility to deliberate system capture, where malignant actors actively use the structural weakness as a weapon.
This is the very essence of food system weaponization. We're moving from an accidental failure to strategic leverage. Food is now, very clearly, a currency of influence and power. Nations that can maintain self-sufficiency in food production suddenly hold significant strategic influence. They're far less susceptible to coercion or diplomatic pressure than countries that are dependent on global markets.
So can you detail some of the tactics of weaponization we're seeing deployed globally?
We can categorize them. The first and most blunt is direct blockades. In the ongoing conflict in Syria, the Assad government used systematic food blockades against rebel-held regions to starve the civilian populations into submission, systematically aiming to break their will and force the surrender of opposition fighters. It's a classic, brutal method that weaponizes the distribution infrastructure itself.
And we're also seeing non-state actors, terrorist groups using similar tactics.
Absolutely. Groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia specifically target humanitarian aid and local food supplies. They'll attack farmers, they'll ransack grain storage, disrupt delivery infrastructure, all to exacerbate acute food insecurity in the regions they control.
And they use the hunger that results as a tool.
As a compliance tool, either forcing populations to adhere to their dictates for basic survival, or recruiting new members who join simply to get access to the food and security the group can provide.
But I think the most immediate and potent geopolitical example has to be Russia's use of its agricultural power.
Russia is leveraging its incredibly privileged position as a food power. It's a top global exporter of both wheat and fertilizer. And it's using that power to wage adversarial competition.
And the tactics in Ukraine have been shocking.
They've been shockingly multifaceted and deliberate.
Yeah.
They include the outright theft of massive quantities of Ukrainian grain stocks, estimated in the millions of tons. The calculated ransacking and removal of specialized farm machinery to cripple future output.
And then the attacks on the infrastructure itself.
Relentless, targeted attacks on port infrastructure and storage facilities along the Black Sea coast. This is an explicit, comprehensive strategy designed to destroy a critical competitor's economy while simultaneously leveraging global price volatility to destabilize importing nations.
This brings us to what you called the final, terrifying modern frontier, the cyber dimension. This digitalization of global logistics has opened up a whole new battleground for gray zone conflict.
It absolutely has. These corporate chains run on extensive data-driven algorithmic technologies. They're leveraging AI, blockchain tracking, remote sensors, hyper-automated processes, all to maintain that just-in-time efficiency.
Which creates an enormous attack surface.
A huge one. The food system, which is designated as critical infrastructure in many nations, is just right for sophisticated cyber exploitation.
So we've seen ransomware attacks, but what does a truly sophisticated attack on agricultural infrastructure actually look like?
Well, the attacks are already surging, particularly targeting those critical windows for planting and harvesting. Ransomware that locks up data is common. We've already seen these attacks plague Midwestern grain elevators, forcing them to revert to inefficient manual processes.
But the specific high-risk threat you're talking about involves targeting the physical controls.
Exactly, targeting the industrial control system.
Like ICS networks.
Yes, the ICS or SCADA networks. These are the systems that run the actual physical machinery, the conveyors, the loading arms, the weigh stations, the ventilation, and the silos. A sophisticated adversary could gain remote access to these networks.
And then what?
And then they could shut down the loading and unloading operations at a major grain terminal. Or worse, cause catastrophic physical damage by manipulating the equipment. It would instantly cripple transportation. Grain can't move, causing instantaneous and severe price spikes, shortages, and panic.
So capturing a single, concentrated digital node can have widespread, paralyzing ramifications in the real world.
That's the threat. The complexity of these digitized systems makes it possible.
So the level of interconnected risk we've just detailed, from corporate concentration to cyber war and geopolitical weaponization, it seems like it's forced states into a sober, pragmatic recognition.
It has.
That in an unstable world, true independence is really defined by physical control over your food supply.
And that realization is fueling the rise of what we're calling state-led resilience strategies. It's moving food systems firmly into the national security framework.
This feels like a huge conceptual shift.
It's seismic. For decades, food was treated primarily as a global commodity, something subject to trade policy. Now it's being recognized as a direct defense and national security concern.
So states are moving beyond just measuring food security
to actively monitoring and controlling the food systems, the process itself and its structural stability. States are deciding that their national survival simply cannot be entrusted to the volatility of global markets alone.
This shift is really illuminated by three specific scenarios we looked at, showing different forms of state intervention that place survival above pure market logic. Let's start with the first one, which focuses on strategic reserves as a physical hard shield. Okay, let's imagine a scenario. There's a manager, let's call him Elias, at a massive state-of-the-art grain terminal. It's a time of intense global instability. The news feeds on his monitor show wheat prices skyrocketing. Ships are being diverted to the highest bidder in some distant wealthy port. But Elias oversees a different reality. He manages a strategic reserve, a silent, concrete mountain of grain that is hard-coded never to enter that speculative market.
Right.
A private distributor calls, desperate to buy out a shipment to flip it for a 300% profit overseas. But Elias's system is already programmed. The grain stays. It moves through a separate, state-controlled network directly to local bakeries at a fixed, stable price.
So the local population is calm. They're unaware that a market-driven famine was just diverted.
Exactly. So the question is, what policy choice does this system represent, and how does it physically defend the nation?
This scenario highlights the core function of modern state-led strategic grain reserve systems. They serve as the ultimate physical defense against the weaponization of global distribution. It is the active political choice to decouple your domestic price stability from international market volatility.
And how is this different from just a large company warehousing inventory?
It's fundamentally different because of the intent and the mechanism. A private company warehouses inventory for future financial gain, for market arbitrage. A strategic state reserve is explicitly designed as a buffer stock that is forbidden from entering that speculative market.
Its primary goal is feeding the population at a fixed, affordable rate, not maximizing a return on investment.
Precisely. And the high-efficiency logistics network they run alongside it is non-speculative. It moves grain based on immediate need and stability mandates, completely bypassing the commercial choke points and the profiteers we discussed earlier.
So it's not just a warehouse, it's a logistics algorithm that values stability over arbitrage.
That's the key. The state, by maintaining this hard shield, acknowledges food as a fundamental public right and a matter of national security, not just a commodity. This ensures guaranteed access, allowing the nation to withstand external shocks, whether they're from climate, conflict, or financial manipulation, that would instantly collapse a purely profit-driven, just-in-time system.
Okay, so let's move to our second scenario. This one deals with a situation where a country has massive industrial output, but financial speculation has locked the supply away.
Right. The food exists, but no one can get it.
Exactly. So we have Elena, a commodity researcher, and she's watching her nation's harvest prices being dictated by distant speculators who will never even see a stalk of wheat. Local shelves are empty because the market has decided it's more profitable to let the grain sit in speculative storage than to sell it locally at an affordable rate.
So the system is efficient at generating wealth for a few, but it's catastrophic for the many.
Until the state intervenes. It breaks free market contracts to seize the supply chain, prioritizing collective survival. Physical trucks, guarded by a state mandate, start delivering flour locally, and instantly those high-frequency trading graphs in some distant city become irrelevant. So when industrial capacity is high but access is locked by finance, how does seizing the supply chain legally and logistically even function? What does it reveal about a nation's priorities?
Well, this illustrates the absolute limits of financialized food distribution when it's faced with an internal crisis. The scenario mandates a move from the abstract world of trading floors back to the physical reality of the supply chain.
So the state has to invoke emergency powers.
A legal mechanism to void or suspend existing commercial contracts. The state is essentially saying the sanctity of this contract is secondary to the survival of our citizens.
That is the ultimate policy edge.
It is. The state then exercises eminent domain over the logistics infrastructure, the silos, the trucks, the processing plants, and it directs the physical movement of the commodity.
Logistically, that must be a huge undertaking.
It requires trained personnel, potentially military or emergency services, to secure those physical assets and ensure the supply is diverted to local channels, like public markets or bakeries, instead of export routes.
So it's a fundamental rejection of the economic principles that govern global trade.
It is. It asserts that the right to food trumps contractual obligations for profit, particularly when you're dealing with staples like flour or rice. It's the moment the high-frequency trading screen is defeated by a fleet of physical delivery trucks.
And it highlights that systemic failure where financialization can actively create local scarcity even when there's industrial-scale agricultural output.
And the intervention is a statement. National resilience demands that the state must be the ultimate guarantor of access.
Okay, finally, let's turn to the grand strategy. Food sovereignty. Let's consider a high-level diplomatic summit. A diplomat from a smaller, agriculturally rich nation is offered a deal.
Okay.
He's offered digital credits, access to global tech markets, in exchange for his country's physical agricultural assets, the land, the seeds, the irrigation rights, and he refuses.
Why?
He realizes that in an era where resources are weaponized, his country's true power is not in their bank balance, which can be frozen with a keystroke, but in the silos they own and the seeds they control. He chooses physical control over global integration. So the question is, why are physical agricultural assets suddenly more powerful than digital wealth or global access in the current geopolitical environment?
This captures the core thesis of deglobalization applied to food. In an era of intense resource competition and sanctions, food sovereignty, the physical, the legal, and the operational control of your soil, your seeds, and your silos becomes the primary indicator of state capacity and national power.
It's an essential recalibration for national strategy.
It is. Nations are realizing that dependence is a lethal vulnerability. Digital credits, foreign bank balances, market access, all of it can be frozen, revoked, or exploited through sanctions and coercion.
But you can't freeze a field of wheat.
You can't. Physical assets, productive farmland, diversified seed banks, secured storage capacity, they constitute hard power. A nation that cannot feed itself is, as the source material puts it, essentially just a colony with a flag.
Because it lacks the foundational independence to make truly sovereign decisions under duress.
Exactly.
So what are the practical protective policies this realization is fueling?
We are seeing a widespread move toward agricultural localization and protectionism. The fragility exposed by the Ukraine war, where over 50 countries were suddenly vulnerable because they relied on a single region for wheat. That accelerated this trend.
What are they doing specifically?
Nations are implementing export restrictions, temporarily banning the sale of staples like rice or palm oil to secure their domestic supply first. They're investing massively in water security and domestic fertilizer production, prioritizing self-sufficiency over the previously touted efficiency of global specialization.
They view control of the food supply as the foundation for everything else.
For geopolitical leverage and, most importantly, for internal stability.
So we've analyzed the centralized systems, the fragile corporate giants, and the robust state fortresses. Now let's pivot to the decentralized solution. Territorial markets.
Right.
These are close-to-home food webs based on community, diversity, and short supply chains. And they seem to offer a superior, more organic form of resilience compared to the systems we've just been discussing.
They do. And the scale of these markets is often overlooked because they don't operate through, multinational exchanges.
Yeah.
Civil society estimates are just astonishing.
What are the numbers?
Over 70% of the world's population is fed by small-scale producers operating within what are often called peasant food webs.
70%.
And they achieve this while using less than 1/3 of the world's agricultural land and resources.
That figure just completely challenges the entire narrative pushed by large agribusinesses that only massive industrial farms can feed the world.
It fundamentally contradicts it. And this isn't just a rural phenomenon. Even in rapidly urbanizing environments, these close-to-home supply chains are central. In many regions, 80% of urban food demand is supplied from within a 500-kilometer radius.
So we're talking about diverse, complex webs,
Yeah.
public markets, street vendors.
Producer cooperatives, direct sales platforms.
Yeah.
They form the actual backbone of global food access, especially for the poor.
So what are the inherent strengths, the resilience attributes of these decentralized models that make them so robust against the kinds of shocks that cripple the big corporate chains?
I think the first is their incredible adaptability and flexibility, which is rooted in social trust.
Okay.
During the depth of the COVID-19 pandemic, when those centralized corporate chains were seizing up and causing all that waste we talked about, territorial markets proved to be incredibly robust because they could pivot quickly. They rapidly adapted their marketing, shifting from physical stalls to community delivery models, leveraging the social capital they already had.
Can you give us a concrete example of that adaptation?
Certainly. In Brazil, for instance, small-scale producers and urban consumers leverage digital tools like WhatsApp group chats, not for high-tech logistics, but for basic, trust-based coordination.
So what were they doing on WhatsApp?
They were organizing communal food aid deliveries, managing direct farmer-to-consumer sales, and rapidly filling the gaps left by the paralyzed corporate distributors. This agility is only possible because the relationships are short, they're personal, and they're built on solidarity, not on distant, rigid contracts.
And secondly, you mentioned economic equity. How do these systems manage to achieve that balance between being affordable for consumers and still profitable for producers?
This is a critical strength. Corporate chains are designed to squeeze margins from both ends, driving down prices paid to producers while raising retail costs for consumers.
The middlemen.
Territorial markets eliminate many of those layers of intermediaries. This means producers capture a much higher share of the final consumer price. Simultaneously, they bring food to market at prices that are accessible to low-income groups because the significant costs of long-distance logistics, corporate overhead, and complex packaging are removed.
Is there data on that?
Yeah, in case studies from Thailand, producers selling in local green farmers markets often derive 60 to 80% of their income from those venues. They earn significantly higher margins than if they sold their same produce to a large-scale, centralized merchant.
And finally, their inherent ties to biodiversity and sustainability must contribute to their resilience against climate shocks.
Absolutely. The centralized corporate system relies so heavily on standardized monocultures, high-yielding varieties of wheat, rice, maize, which are genetically very vulnerable to widespread shocks.
Right. If one disease hits, it can wipe out everything.
Exactly. Territorial markets, on the other hand, thrive on biodiversity and sustainability. They boost climate resilience by providing stable outlets for low-input, agroecologic production, and local traditional crops, or land races, which are often much better suited to local climate variations.
So by maintaining that agrobiodiversity, they're essentially building in natural buffers against pests, diseases, and extreme weather.
Resilience is intrinsically linked to diversity in the natural world, and these markets reflect that principle perfectly.
So if these territorial markets deliver superior resilience, economic equity, and environmental sustainability, why do they struggle to gain ground against the dominant corporate chains? It seems like they're fighting deliberate, entrenched biases.
That is exactly the situation. They operate at a systematic disadvantage due to policy and economic frameworks that are overwhelmingly geared toward industrial production and export.
Let's detail those systemic barriers. Let's start with the policy bias.
Government support globally has been systematically skewed toward industrial export agriculture. Investment flows disproportionately to large-scale commodity infrastructures, deep-water ports, massive interstates, centralized processing facilities, all designed to move goods out of the country or to global buyers.
And
Meanwhile, public marketplaces, which feed the vast majority of people in the global south and many in urban areas worldwide, are chronically starved of basic public services. They often lack clean water, sanitation facilities, adequate storage, and reliable transport links. They're made less efficient and hygienic by design through neglect.
So the state is investing in infrastructure to facilitate external trade, while neglecting the fundamental infrastructure needed to feed its own citizens efficiently. What's the next major barrier?
The second is corporate co-option and power projection. Corporate power seeks to dilute and co-opt the perceived value of local food through sophisticated and often misleading branding.
We see this all the time. Products marketed as family farmed or locally sourced or artisanal.
Despite being products of highly centralized corporate supply chains, sometimes even relying on precarious or coerced labor. This marketing confusion undermines genuine territorial markets and makes it very difficult for consumers to support truly local, resilient economies.
And then globally, the structural trade obstacles seem insurmountable.
They are arguably the most significant structural barrier. Global trade agreements, particularly the WTO's agreement on agriculture, impose rules that fundamentally destabilize local producers. These agreements allow wealthy countries to use massive domestic subsidies to artificially lower the cost of their industrial agricultural products.
And then they essentially flood the markets in the global south with those cheap, subsidized products.
Precisely. This practice, known as dumping, drives the market price below the cost of production for local smallholders. It fundamentally undermines the entire economic basis of territorial markets. And on top of that, these same restrictive WTO rules often obstruct governments in developing nations from legally purchasing food from their own farmers to build those strategic reserves we talked about earlier, even if they wanted to prioritize domestic resilience.
Okay, so given these systemic barriers, where are the genuine leverage points? What policy mechanisms can actually be implemented to deliberately enhance territorial resilience and reverse this decades-long bias?
They need deliberate systemic policy intervention that recognizes the true social and ecological value of these markets. One of the most powerful leverage points is public procurement as a tool.
Meaning the government as a buyer.
Exactly. Governments are massive institutional purchasers, buying food for schools, hospitals, prisons, military bases. By systematically using state purchasing schemes, they can anchor and stabilize local, sustainable, small-scale producers.
Can you provide a strong, detailed example of a successful public procurement mandate?
Brazil's National School Feeding Program, the PNAE, is considered the global gold standard. It legally mandates that a minimum of 30% of all food procured for public canteens must be sourced directly from family farms.
30%, that's a huge guaranteed market.
It is. And crucially, the program often includes a price premium, sometimes 30% above market rates, specifically for agroecological foods. This dual mandate provides stable, guaranteed demand that allows small farmers to invest, to transition to sustainable practices, and to thrive. It's using state purchasing power to rebuild local food systems from the ground up.
Beyond procurement, where else must the financial flows be redirected?
We must shift subsidies. Financial flows need to be redirected away from the industrial food chain, which gets massive hidden subsidies for water, fertilizer, and infrastructure, and towards supporting the critical infrastructure and people underpinning territorial markets.
So upgrading public markets, investing in cold storage for local distribution.
Providing targeted credit for small-scale actors, subsidizing city-rural transit links. Currently, it's estimated that over 70% of smallholders' legitimate financing needs go unmet globally.
And given the volatile world we live in, how do states incorporate this local resilience into hard national security planning?
States must implement serious, legally codified crisis planning. This means establishing emergency food security laws to lay out clear protocols for responding to future shocks.
And what would those laws do?
They must grant the executive the authority to temporarily suspend global trade agreements, certain intellectual property protocols, especially around seeds, and commercial contracts to ensure local populations are fed before commercial obligations are met. This is the legal underpinning necessary to enforce that principle of collective survival over profit in a crisis.
Finally, what about addressing the dominant players themselves, the ones who created this concentration in the first place?
We have to focus on curbing monopolies. Regulations are needed to actively crack down on the massive concentration of corporate power in retail and supply chains. This requires legislation to break up monopolies, but also mandatory transparency measures that document the true costs, the systemic inefficiencies, and the inherent fragilities of the global corporate system. By deliberately decentralizing power at these key nodes, we naturally create a more level playing field for decentralized, resilient territorial markets to operate and grow.
This deep dive began with a chilling historical truth. That famine is less about a lack of food and more about the cold logic of a distribution model prioritizing contracts over human lives. We've seen that the biggest threat to modern food stability is not a single weather event, but the systemic choices made in distinct corporate and political offices that value relentless efficiency above all else. This stark reality is forcing nations to abandon the pure pursuit of frictionless global trade and instead invest heavily in two complementary resilience strategies: the centralized, state-controlled strategic reserves for hard defense, and the decentralized, diverse local food webs for organic stability.
The complex challenge ahead is really managing the necessary interaction between these systems. We can't just dismantle the powerful global corporate apparatus overnight. It provides an undeniable scale. But we must understand that stability cannot rely on profit motives alone. The future of food security rests on how actively we can shift policy and finance to integrate ecological health, social equity, and physical national control into every single decision regarding food. True system resilience demands a fundamental reorientation that moves the fate of our food supply out of the hands of global financial speculation and back into the physical control of communities and nations.